I'm Dr. Drew Miller, retired Air Force Colonel, Intelligence Officer, and President of the Collapse Survival Institute. This threat assessment briefing assesses China's ability to win in a war over Taiwan based on their willingness to escalate to nuclear weapons use and their economy, society, and government that is far better prepared to wage a war and survive in the age of collapse with disasters and weapons of mass destruction. China can confidently play nuclear chicken with the US and prevail. The POTUS will swerve away to avoid nuclear devastation, not sacrifice millions of US lives to defend Taiwan. We have more nuclear weapons than China, but they have plenty, 600, far more than they need to force the US to back down. They might start with nuclear strikes on the battlefield, inflict losses that US citizens won't find worth the price of defending Taiwan, a breakaway province of China. The US can't fight a long conventional war against China because we're already low on precision conventional weapons, and we can't produce replacement weapons because we are dependent on parts, chips, and supplies from China. China can also attack the US, including our highly vulnerable electric grid with the thousands of agents they have in country, as well as cyber and other attacks. But most importantly, China's economy, society, and government are very well prepared to fight a long war, suffer through nuclear strikes, and survive collapse disasters, while the US is not. I'll cover all this in the next few slides. Before explaining these 6 reasons why China will defeat the US in a war over Taiwan, you need to understand the real truth about Taiwan, not the nonsense spouted by career politicians in the US. Taiwan is a province of China that broke away after the communists won a long civil war in 1949. George Marshall and President Truman wisely refused to interfere in the Civil War, but due to Senator McCarthy and the Big Red Scare in the US in the 1950s, career politicians pledged to defend Taiwan to prove they were tough on communists and not engaged in appeasement, both nonsense comparisons. The United Nations recognizes that Taiwan is not an independent nation, but a breakaway part of China, as does official US policy, since Kissinger and Nixon rightly got the US back to friendly terms with China. But career politicians in the US, always pandering for votes by trying to look tough on communism, love to brag about how they'll defend Taiwan and stand up to communist China. So US policy towards Taiwan is shaped by this vote pandering. China is committed to retake control of their breakaway province by military force if necessary, and has been building up their military and expanding in the South China Sea to enable military victory to retake Taiwan. Chinese President Xi has declared reunification with Taiwan to be his top must-do priority. The PRC's military preparations to retake Taiwan have been reported on, warned about by multiple military and intelligence agencies. Some of these warnings have been condemned by the Pentagon and administrative officials and government-funded think tanks, since they conflict with administration messaging that U.S. policy towards China is working and war is unlikely. Again, the U.S. does have nuclear superiority, but China's estimated 600 nuclear weapons are much more than they need to start a nuclear exchange with the U.S. if we back Taiwan and coerce the U.S. to back down, surrender Taiwan to China. In a war over Taiwan, Chinese leaders can easily force the U.S. to back down. All they have to do is threaten use of nuclear weapons against either U.S. ships and vessels in the area or strikes on the U.S. homeland, and the U.S. president will back down. As soon as the U.S. suffers nuclear strikes, the public will demand not fighting a nuclear war to protect Taiwan, a breakaway part of China, per official U.S. and UN agreement. If the president wants to act tough, there may be a round or even 2 of nuclear exchanges, but in a game of nuclear chicken, the U.S. will back down and stop interfering in China's civil war. This was played out in a military-style training exercise on the Collapse Survivor app. China's leaders are absolutely committed to bringing the breakaway province of Taiwan back under Chinese control, and they can suffer tens of millions of casualties if necessary to force the U.S. to back down. If the president doesn't quit fast, it only takes 1 or 2 nuclear detonations high in our atmosphere to destroy the U.S. electric grid. And according to experts, it will take us over a year to repair the grid, and in this time period, we could lose up to 90% of the U.S. population. The overriding reality is that despite smaller nuclear forces, the Chinese are willing to suffer millions of casualties in a nuclear war, and the US is not. This is probably China's greatest advantage over the US. And if the president is stupid enough to play this suicidal game long enough to let our electric grid get destroyed, China will emerge as the world's clear, dominant superpower. China's first use of nuclear weapons to coerce the U.S. into backing down and to inflict casualties might not be strikes on U.S. cities, but Chinese attacks to take out U.S. space-based GPS satellites and limited nuclear strikes to quickly destroy U.S. military forces near Taiwan. Due to domestic politics, not military advantage, disgusting career politicians pandering for votes unilaterally abandon all of our U.S. battlefield nuclear weapons. The anti-nuclear movement is a powerful political force, so the Bush administration scored political points by unilaterally eliminating all U.S. ground battlefield nuclear weapons. The Army has nothing left with in terms of nuclear weapons to call in for quick battlefield nuclear strikes that are needed to stop a heavy enemy ground attack and breakthrough. Aircraft delivered tactical nuclear weapons may not be able to reach the target and take too long. They're far too slow to deliver the prompt, well-timed battlefield nuclear strike that you need if you're going to stop an enemy breakthrough. Russia and China not only kept, but continue to modernize and expand their tactical battlefield nuclear weapons. China also has more advanced hypersonic cruise missiles than the US, capable of defeating our air defenses and capable of carrying nuclear weapons. If a conventional or limited battlefield theater nuclear war over Taiwan occurs, the US will lose because we will run out of ammunition and cannot build replacement weapons without China. The massive Ukrainian expenditure of US and NATO munitions has drawn down our stockpiles, and President Trump's war on Iran has further depleted our offensive and defensive missile inventory. China has a huge, robust defense industry. We have a dependent industry. The US government has incredibly, irresponsibly outsourced our military supply chain to China. Over 40% of semiconductors used in Department of Defense weapon systems and associated infrastructure are sourced from China. China controls world rare earth materials, mining 69% of them and processing about 90%. The newest Ford-class aircraft carrier depends on over 6,500 Chinese-sourced semiconductors, and many other ships and aircraft are similarly dependent. All our advanced weapon systems, including missiles, tanks, air defense systems, all of them rely on components or materials sourced from China, by far the largest foreign supplier of critical technologies for the Department of Defense. Many believe this leaves critical military equipment vulnerable to sabotage as well. Chinese might have a Trojan horse chip where they can disable or stop a military system. There is no doubt that China does have the ability to disrupt or stop most of our advanced conventional weapons defense production by simply withholding key inputs. The data analytical firm Jovini, hired by the Department of Defense to study our defense industrial base and supply chain, reported that with just 25 well-constructed attacks using any variety of means, an adversary military or domestic agents could cripple much of the U.S. defense industry capacity. This report on the U.S. defense supply chain blamed the failure of America's defense industrial base to decades of irresponsible federal government policies, ignoring many, many warnings of obvious dependence on China. As a former product manager of the Department of Defense Innovation Unit put it, quote, "The U.S. may be the first country to deliberately outsource its military supply chain to an adversary in exchange for cost savings," unquote. The thousands of Chinese agents in the U.S. might target our defense industry, or they may go after our fragile electric grid, delivering a crushing blow that immediately cripples U.S. conventional military power and forces every asset we've got into dealing with the collapse disaster that will result. We'd have no resources to devote to overseas military assistance to Taiwan or anyone else. Chinese agents can execute cyber and physical attacks on this electric grid, and many may already be working inside critical infrastructure where they're perfectly positioned to sabotage and destroy equipment. China exceeds the US in wartime economic resources and also has what I call domestic survival capability that dwarfs the highly vulnerable US. US politicians abandoned the civil defense program of stockpiling food decades ago, preferring spending that could buy them more re-election votes. For collapse survival, stockpiled food is probably the single most important thing, other than the weapons and ammo, to defend your stockpile. China has prepared their citizens for survival with huge stockpiles to feed their entire population for over a year. The US government has set its population up for starvation, even exploitation in a collapse. US government preparations are limited to just top government officials' survival. The government actually even has executive orders authorizing government agencies to seize stored food from citizens. What about the U.S. Strategic Stockpile Program? It is for medical equipment, petroleum, and very limited amounts of other materials that the federal and state governments can draw on. That's the correct wording. These supplies are for government agencies who may or may not pass on supplies to normal citizens after their continuity of government priority is met. The U.S. produces about 83% of the food we consume, but this production is highly dependent on mechanized farms with just-in-time deliveries of imported fertilizers, seeds shipped in from a few big seed companies, with farming conducted by less than 1% of the population. China produces 70% of the world's pesticide products, and the U.S. is one of the largest importers. In a collapse with the grid down, there may be no fuel production or distribution, no imported fertilizers or pesticides, disruption of seed suppliers, lack of trains and trucks to transport crops to food manufacturers who can't operate without the electric grid. Little to no food may be produced or distributed. We have a highly complex and cost-effective food production system in good times, but it's a setup for starvation disaster in a collapse. The largest food producer in the world is not the US, it's China. China's workforce engaged in agricultural, fishing, forestry, and food production is 22% of their population. China is a big food importer, but much of this is soybeans used to feed pigs. In a collapsed survival situation, grain would go directly to feed people, which is far more efficient than feeding meat animals. While Fortitude Ranch, the nation's largest survival community, has chickens and ranch animals, the bulk of their food production is from gardening, growing corn and potatoes and sunchokes. That is far more efficient than trying to feed grain to animals. The largest part of the U.S. economy, gross domestic product, are finance, software, entertainment, social media crap, government spending, all worthless in feeding and protecting the population and surviving in a collapse. Manufacturing accounts for just 10% of U.S. GDP. The most important economic sector, food production, doesn't even account for 1% of U.S. GDP. China has 7% of its GDP in food production, with manufacturing its number one largest economic sector, 30% of China's GDP, 3 times the percentage of the US. China has almost twice the manufacturing output of the United States. The arsenal of democracy has become a second-tier manufacturer, and much of that dependent on Chinese inputs. China's economy is designed for producing manufactured goods and food, not entertainment and services and software. With responsible government and a strong economy, China will survive a collapse. The U.S. is on the opposite end of the spectrum due to disastrous policies of our irresponsible, self-serving government and their gross dishonesty in failing to warn citizens of serious threats or take actions to protect citizens. When talking about national security and survival, we need to stop using gross domestic product economic measures. What is relevant to defense and survival is what I call domestic survival capability. To survive a collapse when the economy is not functioning, people are not coming to work, and there's widespread loss of law and order as people without food and water struggle and steal, even kill to survive, a population needs to have reliable food and water and security. It is domestic survival capability that really matters in the age of collapse, and China has far more domestic survival capability because of their government stockpiling food and resources, strong manufacturing and agriculture that can produce in a collapse. In addition, the Chinese Communist Party can instate strict diet restrictions and rationing while averting social unrest and popular revolt. The US could not do this. If a big nuclear exchange results, China can quickly order urban residents out into the countryside to become agricultural laborers. The US government can't even get citizens to wear a mask if they don't want to. It seemed odd how during the COVID-19 pandemic, China was locking up and forcing its citizens to stay home, putting on far more restrictions than any other country, far beyond what was really necessary. These actions may have been less for reducing pandemic casualties than training their population to follow government orders, do whatever they direct. China has a huge advantage in its ability to mobilize, direct, and control its huge population to do whatever the government directs. This is an element of military and industrial power that the US lacks, power that could be decisive in a crisis or war. If you compare capability to wage war over Taiwan and survive nuclear exchanges and WMD attacks, survive the damage AI can inflict, China will be the winner. This slide compares the capabilities of China versus the US on a 10-point scale. 10 is extremely capable and good. 1, the red colors there, are very poor capability, a big vulnerability. You can pause this video and study the details. The US does have conventional weapons technological superiority and more and better strategic nuclear weapons, but that doesn't matter much in a limited war over Taiwan. It's just a question of how much destruction is the POTUS willing to suffer before backing down to China, who will not back down in a war over Taiwan. The US is at a huge disadvantage because of our decades of irresponsible government ignoring the warnings about control of rare earth minerals, our increasing dependence on Chinese manufacturing, industrial agriculture that can't produce food in a collapse, survival preparations limited only to top government officials, nothing for citizens. But the biggest, worst vulnerability we have, the biggest Achilles heel that we've got, is the US electric grid. It is a huge vulnerability. That is the worst problem we've got. Our electric grid is easy to destroy, easy for North Korea even. North Korea, with its very tiny, inaccurate nuclear weapons, can destroy the US electric grid. It only takes 1 or 2 high-altitude nuclear detonations, and the electromagnetic pulse EMP attack that results could wipe out the vast majority of our electric grid. The congressionally funded EMP Commission, with the top experts in the field, issued a report warning that our grid is very vulnerable, must be hardened, or 90% of Americans could die in the years it takes to rebuild the grid after an EMP attack. So what did Congress do when their commission reported back to them that 90% of Americans could be killed? Nothing. The career politicians in Congress, always prioritizing their next re-election campaign and fearful of losing votes with higher electric bills, have never taken any action. Again, it's easy to destroy U.S. conventional military support. If you want to knock this out, take down our electric grid. You disable the U.S. military immediately. Our conventional military power is gone when that happens. China is well prepared to survive in the age of collapse, but the U.S. government is not, because of our irresponsible, unconstitutional government and career politicians always focused on pandering for re-election votes. They have set us up for annihilation in the age of collapse. This book describes a lot of the reforms and preparations that we need to survive in the age of collapse, but the number one thing we frankly need is term limits. We must get rid of career politicians prioritizing pandering for re-election and amassing political power, not their proper job of protecting us against threats that we can't handle on our own. China is well prepared to survive in the age of collapse, but the U.S. is not, because of our irresponsible, unconstitutional government and career politicians. They have set us up for annihilation in the age of collapse. War with China over Taiwan would be suicidal for the U.S., but being tough on communists buys votes, so the career politicians are still pandering for votes by bragging about defending Taiwan and waging an AI arms race with China. The U.S. has no legitimate business engaging in the resolution of China's civil war. The U.S. could be destroyed if we do not quickly eliminate our irresponsible, suicidal promises to defend Taiwan. By denouncing a commitment to defend Taiwan now, we leave the Taiwanese the time to either negotiate a reunification they can accept or build up defenses sufficient to deter or defeat a Chinese invasion, as they've been able to do for over half a century now. Other briefings explain why computer chips from Taiwan are not a threat to the US or justification to fight over Taiwan. And there's a briefing on the AI threat that calls for partnering with China to control AI, the worst threat we've ever faced, before it destroys us. This is not possible unless we end our interference in their unfinished civil war with Taiwan. Again, China is far better positioned to deal with WMD attacks and nuclear war and supply chain disruptions and survive in the age of collapse in the United States. I'm Colonel Drew Miller, President of the Collapse Survival Institute. Prepare for the worst, enjoy the present.
To get the quickest warnings of pending collapse disasters and preparedness news updates, click subscribe